world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Thursday, November 6th, as you are listening to this. And we've got a lot to talk about. We always do. We are 2 days out from election night, and yesterday was a big day for reactions to those elections. Now, Republicans are trying to play off the elections. We know they're scared because of how bad they are trying to spin the narrative about those elections. Well, they're saying things like, well, Democrats won because of course they would. It was Democratic areas, etc. When it came to Prop 50 in California, congressional Republicans in the state legislature in California are already talking about suing over it, saying it wasn't a legal ballot initiative, which they failed before the election to prevent it. Basically, they're just trying to change the rules. They're trying to get the courts to side in their favor. They don't like the fact that it passed. Now, Prop 50 was the ballot initiative to redistrict California, which could cost Republicans up to 5 seats. This is in response to what happened in Texas, where the Texas legislature redrew their state maps. And they drew out 5 democratically held seats. And the difference between what happened in Texas and what happened in California is that the Texas legislature just did it without any sort of voter opinion. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, took to the polls because legally he was required to and asked the voters, should we do this? And they passed it overwhelmingly. Which is a huge thing. So Republicans are scared about that. They're trying to move the goalposts, and their main talking point as to why they didn't win, including this is coming from Donald Trump. He made a couple talking points about it. One was he was talking about how the Republicans only lost because he wasn't on the ballot, and that the government shutdown is affecting the way people vote. Well, that's interesting for 2 reasons. One, if he's not on the ballot and they can't win, like I talked about yesterday, he's never going to be on a ballot again. He is not eligible to run for the presidency or vice presidency ever again. I'll get into that in a little bit. And he's not probably going to be running for Senate or any other major office statewide. And there's no other nationwide thing where he could be on the ballot for in every state. So if he's not on the ballot and Republicans can't win because he's not on the ballot, I guess that means they never win again. Now, then he was talking about how the shutdown is the reason why people voted for the Democrats. Well, that would mean if the shutdown's the reason people voted Democratic, that it's not a Democratic shutdown. That it is actually, or that people actually believe it is the Republicans' fault that the government has now been shut down as of today for 37 days now, because they didn't fix anything yesterday. They're not getting any closer to an agreement, despite some of the things we are hearing. So by Donald Trump saying that the government shutdown affected how people voted, that means they're blaming Republicans and voting accordingly. Which that just tells me that Republicans know how bad this is, and they are trying desperately to avoid the narrative, trying to spin the narrative going into the midterms, because I think they are terrified of what is going to happen. Now, Mike Johnson was one of the ones trying to spin that narrative. And he effectively came out and said that if they lose the midterms, like I think they will, I have been saying they are going to lose. The Democrats are going to take the House by 40 to 50 seats, but it doesn't matter if they can. Like Republicans can only lose 2 seats and maintain power in the House. So if they even lose it by 3, where it flips positions, he says if Democrats get control of the House, Donald Trump would effectively become a 2-year president, which is true. He even said that they would probably try to impeach Donald Trump day one. Now, why would the Democrats try to impeach Donald Trump? Let's think about that for a second. Democrats are not like Republicans. They wouldn't impeach Donald Trump just because they don't like him. So there would have to be a reason. Well, what could Donald Trump have done that would be impeachable? Let's see. We have his tariff policies that are probably unconstitutional. I will get into that in a little bit later as well. We're going to talk about those oral arguments before the Supreme Court. You have him destroying the East Wing of the White House to put up a ballroom that nobody asked for, destroying the East Wing without going through the proper channels or talking to anybody about and getting approval from the committees that he was required to get approval from to put up this ballroom. Now, there are some people that are saying that, maybe it's just to deal with the bunker that's underneath, and he's trying to make it so he's got a safe space underneath the White House, reinforce that bunker. Again, it's not the problem of what he is doing, it is the how he is going about it. He comes out like the day after or 2 days after the No Kings protest, where 7 to 10 million people came out nationwide saying, we don't like Donald Trump. We are out protesting what this administration is doing. And he just brings a backhoe in and just starts tearing down the East Wing. There are proper ways to go about remodeling the White House, including talking to different committees in Washington, D.C. that are not meeting right now because of the government shutdown. You're also typically supposed to go through Congress. I mean, Republicans lost their minds when former President Barack Obama installed a basketball court on the White House grounds. And all he did to put in the basketball court was put 2 hoops on opposite ends of a tennis court that was already there and paint some lines on the tennis court so it could be multi-purpose. Similar to what you would see in some cases on playgrounds or at city parks, things like that. Probably cost a couple $1,000s at most, and that was the end of it. But you would have thought, and they're trying to use that now again as justification for what Donald Trump did. You would have thought he had torn down the East Wing the way they reacted at the time. So you have his remodel to the East Wing. That could be part of it. You have him moving money around, potentially. And we know of at least what he is saying. For example, with this government shutdown, he told Pete Hegseth to find money to pay the military for the first paycheck in October. Now, I'm not 100% sure that paycheck actually got paid because I haven't heard anything one way or the other definitively from anybody that I know and from any news sources that have said that they know definitively whether or not the military got paid. The only thing we know is coming out of this administration, and well, they've been a little fast and loose with the truth. But supposedly there was research and development grant money that didn't go out anywhere that they found that they could use to pay the payroll for the first part of October. And then you have him taking this anonymous gift for the second payroll, the second paycheck in October, that amounts to about every member of the military getting like $75 to $100 because it was only $130 million. Well, that's not nearly enough to cover all of the payroll. But the fact that he even accepted it without getting approval from anybody is something else that could potentially be impeachable. Then you have the accepting of the jet from Qatar and agreeing to retrofit it for use as Air Force One. Again, accepting a gift from a foreign country, and he is going to try to transfer that gift to himself or his presidential library when he is out of office, so he can use it for his own personal aircraft after he leaves office. That could be considered a violation. Then you have the way he has been using ICE and how he is publicly going after certain people, like with his post to Truth Social telling the Attorney General to go after James Comey, Letitia James, Adam Schiff, among others, that he knows they are criminals and they need to be charged. All of that is things that uh, he could be impeached for. He could be impeached for blowing up these boats coming from Venezuela, these fishing boats that actually weren't even heading to U.S. waters. We've talked about it before. The proper way to handle this is not to just sink them and blow them up in international waters, which is probably a war crime. Um, the proper way to handle it would be let them get to U.S. waters. If we know they're already coming, and we've already had reconnaissance since on them just in international water or waters right off of Venezuela, we can track them all the way here. As soon as they get here, have the Coast Guard intercept them, board, search, and then if there is contraband, you seize the contraband and you seize the people on board, the smugglers, you charge them and you deal with it that way. You don't just blow them up acting like judge, jury, and executioner. There are so many things that he could be impeached for. Well, Mike Johnson says if Democrats get control of the House, they'd impeach him. He's probably right. They would also, just by virtue of having control of the House, block anything he attempts to get done for 2 years. So that tells me that Republicans are terrified that they are going to lose the House in the upcoming midterm elections. And that is all in response to the elections that happened just 2 nights ago. So Donald Trump he's answering questions and he's talking about it and he's giving remarks. And he's talking about voting, of course, and his favorite thing is he claims it was all rigged and cheating and stuff. And that's why he said we need to end the government shutdown and we need to get Congress back in session. Okay, I agree. Congress needs to get back into session. We need to bring the House back. And he said they need to get rid of the filibuster. Now, he is getting pushback from Senate Republicans. They will not end the filibuster. Why? Because they want to use the filibuster when they are in the minority. They know eventually and possibly as soon as 2026 after the midterms, they may be the minority party again. And Donald Trump is saying that he doesn't care about that. He wants the filibuster gone. Republicans want to keep it because when they're the minority, they can block a bunch of things Democrats want to get done because you need 60 votes. That's why Democrats can never seem to get as far as they would like advancing the narrative, advancing progressive ideas. Okay. So, but he wants to get rid of the filibuster and he wants them to reopen the government. Okay. But it's not because he wants to fund all the assistance programs that everybody's freaking out about, or he's not worried about all of that. No, he wants them to get rid of the filibuster, come back, get the government open, and then focus on his priority of enacting a voter ID law and ending mail-in balloting nationwide. Well, a couple problems with ending mail-in balloting nationwide. One, that disenfranchises a bunch of people who may not be able to get to a polling location for various reasons. They're disabled, they're elderly, they're overseas, they're not, sometimes the military, if they are stationed, somewhere other than their home area, they don't always keep their voter registration where it used to be. They have it, they move it, and they don't move the registration when they move, so they are still registered back where they were from initially. That kind of thing. Then you also have college students who are wouldn't always move their voter registration because they're not living where they are, so maybe they vote by mail. But Donald Trump wants to do away with it. Well, aside from disenfranchising a bunch of people, and he himself has voted by mail, I believe, twice for himself for president, but that's another story again. He wants to get rid of vote by mail. Beyond that, he thinks we need to go have voter ID laws. Now, I did a TikTok about this yesterday, and I've talked about it numerous times over the last year or so. Voter ID laws, there's a problem with it. The whole premise is that why they claim you need to present a voter ID is that undocumented illegal immigrants are going to try to vote, and that you should be able to present an ID in order to vote. Now, a lot of places have voter ID laws already in some way, shape, or form. For example, here in Iowa, I know I had to present an ID when I went to go vote. But there is like there's like several alternative ways to prove who you are, including I believe you can present like a certain number of pieces of mail from various sources, and I think one of them has to be something official from like a government agency or something like that. Maybe your water bill, perhaps, or um, like something from like the IRS with your name and current address on it. Like you got a letter with your refund check from this year or something. Um, Maybe it is your vehicle registration or something like that. Um, you can present alternative ways to actually identify yourself if you don't have an ID. Now, one of the other reasons as to why voter ID laws get pushback, it's not so much about having the ID. It is the fact that having an ID or forcing them to have an ID results in it effectively being a poll tax, because almost every state has some kind of an ID law or an ID, and almost all of them cost money. And if you don't have it, it costs money to replace it, etc. So just by virtue of having an ID and having an amount on there, you are putting a poll tax on. And not everybody has an ID because they have chosen that they don't think they can afford the money at the time to actually get that ID, which then would make it a tax, which is illegal. You can't charge somebody money to go vote. But Republicans don't see it that way. Also, one of the other things that they want to do with these voter ID laws in a lot of cases is they want to make it so your ID must match your birth certificate. But that doesn't always fly when or you have somebody who has legally changed their name for one reason or another. For example, you have somebody who got married and took their spouse's last name. Well, they don't change your birth certificate for that. They give you a separate name change form, and then you would need to have both documents. And then if you get divorced, you would need to have a third document showing you're divorced and that it was changed back. And if you get married again, you would need to keep every layer of documentation where your name has ever changed. Makes it very difficult. And that the whole idea is to prevent people from being able to vote. And because they know, because if you look at what happened Tuesday night, when voters turn out, Republicans lose. So they want to make it difficult for people to vote. That way, they have lower voter turnout and they have a better chance of winning. Now, Donald Trump said something else very interesting that he got a lot of pushback online for. Along with talking about voter ID, it just proved he's either going senile or that he has never gone grocery shopping. And that was when he was talking about voter ID. He said, well, you have to present your ID to go buy groceries, but you don't have to when you go vote. Proves he's never really gone to grocery shopping. You typically don't have to present an ID when you're grocery shopping unless you are buying age-controlled items at the grocery store. Typically, things like alcohol, cigarettes, and I know at least one grocery store locally sells dry ice, which is also age-controlled. Beyond that, you don't need an ID. The only time you would have needed an ID in the past is if you might have needed it when you were writing a check. But most places don't even take those anymore because most people don't write them. And when they did, there were a lot of people who abused the system and were writing bad checks. So they quit taking them. But Donald Trump comes out and says, well, you need an ID to buy groceries. You need an ID to buy gas. Again, you don't. The only time you need an ID at a gas station is typically if you're buying cigarettes or alcohol, or maybe lottery tickets, something like that. Again, age-restricted items. But it just proves how out of touch he is with everything that really goes on. I don't know if he has ever actually stepped foot in an actual grocery store to buy his own groceries. And this whole idea about needing an ideal, like I said, is just adding a layer of complexity that we don't need. And the other problem with that is that he doesn't realize that states run their own elections. That's why we have differing state laws about what is or isn't allowed. And that's why different states decide when their polls close. How long after do they accept their mail-in balloting? Things like that. Passing any sort of nationwide thing would certainly be challenged in court, and he probably would lose. But Donald Trump doesn't care about that. He now has a soundbite, and he has red meat that his followers can regurgitate to everybody when they're talking about these election losses. So going past the elections and the election losses, et cetera, and all of that, Donald Trump had oral arguments at the Supreme Court today. Now, he did not attend these oral arguments. These were on the tariff case, but whether or not Donald Trump legally has the authority to impose tariffs. And what did we find out from those oral arguments? Well, if you listened to them or read clips of it, it was 3 hours long. Of course, I did not listen to the entirety of it. I only saw some of the notable excerpts from it online, but it sounded like the justices were not pulling any punches, and they kept hammering the DOJ over their position about where these tariffs come from. They actually got the DOJ to admit that they said 80%, but that number is actually still wrong because it's 100% of the tariffs are paid for ultimately by the U.S. taxpayer. Why? Because, as we've talked about before, how tariffs work is when you have an item that hits the port and it is charged a tariff, the importer, the company that brings it in, must pay the tariff. And then when they pay it, it goes down the supply chain at every stop with it now that added cost into it. So if you have an item that used to cost Walmart $10, hits the port, now is $15, well, they're not going to sell it for $12 like they used to. They may sell it for $17 to $20 because they have to make money. They're not going to sell it for less than $15 if they had a 50% tariff on it, because that was $5 they had to spend to bring that $10 item in. So these tariffs that have come in are ultimately paid by the U.S. taxpayer. And they got the DOJ to admit that in court, that it does not work the way Donald Trump would have you believe. He genuinely believes when he puts tariffs on that it would be, if he puts a 50% tariff on for stuff coming from Canada, for example, and that item comes across the border, that the money goes from the Canadian Treasury to the U.S. Treasury, and that the country of Canada just pays it, and it's never recouped anywhere along the way. Even if it worked the way Donald Trump claimed that it came from the country of Canada, not the company that is importing the item here into the United States, Canada would pass that cost back on to the companies they are charging, and it would still get paid for by the company that produces the item, and they would up their cost when sending it back across the border. It would be a never-ending cycle. The whole thing doesn't make any sense the way Donald Trump would have you believe. But as the justices are going into all of this, and they're talking about, the tariffs, etc., and what's going on there, that they just were very skeptical about um, Donald Trump having the actual authority to use tariffs and whether or not he can just say, well, it's an emergency, I can do what I want. One of the questions that was posed to the DOJ involved if Congress granted the president some emergency powers to unilaterally use the military basically and declare war, could he just claim national emergency and go after somebody who has done nothing to him and effectively declare war without Congress? And even the DOJ attorney said, well, in that situation, they would have to go back to Congress and get an actual war declaration. And that's where this all sits, is because of how the Constitution is written. It says the power to lay tariffs or duties and taxes, which a tariff is a tax, resides with Congress. So we will see how they, rule on this Supreme Court case, how they are going to rule on whether or not Donald Trump has the ability to impose these tariffs. Are they going to side with Trump or not? And now, when will we get an answer? With this Supreme Court, who knows? With it being one of the things that they took up kind of on an emergency basis, even though they heard it through the oral proceedings where they would have oral arguments, etc. This has all happened in the last 10 months, that it has worked its way through the courts and has already ended up at the docket. They may fast track this and we may have an answer by the end of the year, but at the latest, we should have an answer by May or June of next year, at the end of their session when they release all of their major opinions for the year. Then they'll take July, August, and September off and come back in October with a new session. Now, typically, they do not carry over anything from one session to the next, and there should not be any sort of outlier case like this where they wouldn't have a decision met. So we should know before they go on their summer break. All right. What happens to the tariffs when or if the Supreme Court rules against Donald Trump? Well, if they rule against Donald Trump, those tariffs could go away. And they could go away permanently. They would have to get passed through Congress to approve any amounts he wants. Well, that takes time. And you already have a Senate that has passed several measures to get rid of the tariffs. And they have not been taken up by the House of Representatives because the House of Representatives is still gone. But that being said, they have passed 3 different measures with bipartisan support saying, no, we do not give Donald Trump tariff authority. We want to claw back these tariffs. They don't work, and the national emergency he is claiming doesn't exist. Now, that's a bad sign if Donald Trump would want to pass new tariffs through the Senate and try to do something that way. So overall, the Supreme Court oral arguments did not look good for Donald Trump, but it's hard to tell how they will ultimately rule because, it is the Supreme Court. They can rule any way they want. But by listening to their line of questioning, it does give you an idea about which way they are going to go on any major case. All right. Now, I talked earlier about how Donald Trump is not going to be on a ballot again. Let's talk about that a little bit real quick. He's not going to be on a ballot. He is not eligible to be president again. The 22nd Amendment says no person can be elected to the office of president more than twice. He has been elected twice. Therefore, he is ineligible to be a presidential candidate for a 3rd term. Okay. Well, then we hear that they've got a plan to make him president again, or he'll be able to run for a 3rd term. The only thing we've heard as far as any sort of a plan is that he would run as somebody like J.D. Vance's VP. Well, here's the problem. The 12th Amendment says you are ineligible to be vice president if you are ineligible to be president. The 12th Amendment was also what changed how we handle electing the vice president. It used to be that now this was in the very early days, and they changed it as early as the very early 1800s. I don't remember which year exactly. Um, that how the presidency and the vice presidency worked is there was only one spot you ran for. You ran to be president. If you did not win, the person who got the second most votes became the vice president. Well, they decided to change that. They didn't like that idea because once they started to form political parties and having, you know, doing things based on ideologies like that and coming together, they found out that having a president and a vice president from opposing political parties was not a good idea. It didn't work out well. So they changed that with the 12th Amendment, but they also said if you are ineligible to run for president, you are ineligible to run for vice president, which would mean Donald Trump could not run for the vice presidency with J.D. Vance at the top of the ticket. Now, the other thing we are hearing is that there is this weird idea being floated around by some people who are just terrified of what Donald Trump could do, and that being that he is going to be somehow named Speaker of the House. Well, a couple things with that. If he gets named Speaker of the House, he couldn't be named Speaker of the House until after 2029, when his term is up. Okay? If Democrats retake the House 26 and they hold it in 28, there's no way he becomes Speaker in 29 because Democrats would be in control. If by some miracle for Republicans, and it would take almost an exact miracle, especially with how things are going right now, they would have the House in 29. The House of Representatives has never selected a non-member to be Speaker of the House. It's never happened. Yes, there was the thing during the 2022 midterms where before they selected Kevin McCarthy, where Donald Trump got nominated a few times in the rounds of voting, but you need 218 votes to be Speaker of the House, and I think the most he ever got was like 12. Beyond that, Donald Trump is probably not going to be healthy enough to be president between here and there. I believe something is going to happen to him. He already appears to have issues. You have his swollen ankles. You have his slurred speech. We again saw images as he was delivering remarks at varying points today, and I think it was because he was tired and stressed out because of probably staying up later, watching election results come in and fuming about how Republicans lost nationwide, etc., where you started to see his face drooping to one side again. At varying points, he slurs his speech. You have everything that happened in the Asia trip where it appeared that he was just wandering around at several points and had to be led where he was going. He talked about needing extra help going downstairs, like coming off of Air Force One, which indicates that he is probably having some kind of balance issue. And then it appeared that he was dragging his one foot. Well, one of the things that I know happens with stroke victims, and I'm not a medical expert by any means, I just know a few things because I've seen a few things, is that when you do have a stroke, certain people who have had it have a problem with their balance and in the movements of their legs, where normally when you walk, as you go to step, you step heel first. And you kind of roll to the ball and you push yourself off the ball of your foot to take your next step, and then you step with your heel. Again, your heel is designed to take that impact. Well, it looks like he's dragging his foot, which means he is not able to lift his foot fully to get that full heel strike, and he is having control issues with his leg, which can be a sign of a stroke. And then you have the fact, now he calls them, what did he say? They were aptitude tests or IQ tests, and that they were very difficult. But as he was describing it, he was talking about the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. You don't give the Montreal Cognitive Assessment just to anybody. That is not part of a routine physical. I've had routine physicals over the years because it was part of my health insurance. I was able to save money on my insurance premiums at the time by getting a yearly physical done, a yearly exam. Never once was I ever offered a Montreal cognitive assessment. You don't issue that unless you suspect something like dementia, a stroke, or some other traumatic brain event. So he's talking about having taken these, and he was talking about having to take them all the way back during his first term. Now he was much more cognitive back then, but that's the whole point here. He's taking them. And the fact that he's taking it more than once tells me that whatever they were worried about back during his first term is still ongoing, or he has had a new event between here and there, which just leads me to question whether or not his health is going to be good enough to make it all the way to 2028 into the general election. All of those things combined, I just don't know if he is going to be around long enough. And we were talking about how Mike Johnson is worried that Democrats are going to impeach Donald Trump. Well, I've talked about it before. Donald Trump's political capital is already spent. I think there's going to be some conversations being held behind closed doors with the Republicans after the embarrassing blowout that happened 2 nights ago. Now, I think these conversations have been going on the whole time, but I think with that, they're going to be having some conversations about, okay, is he going to cost us the midterms? Is it going to be bad enough? Do we have to break from Donald Trump? Where do we break from Donald Trump from? And do we worry about him seeking retribution because we have to win the midterms? We may lose the midterms. If we lose the House, then what are we going to do? You know, if he costs them the House and the Senate in the midterms, there is a greater than zero chance that the Republicans either A, would move to get rid of Donald Trump in that little window between the election day and January 3rd, when the new Congress takes over. There'll be about a 2-month window where they would still be in charge. And that the Republicans could sit there and go, okay, we got to do something. We've got to get rid of Donald Trump and try to move toward J.D. Vance. And if they do that, and Donald Trump is still able to be communicating with the outside world, if he's still able to post on Truth Social, if he's still able to talk and give interviews, he will burn the Republican Party down around him. Their best hope is that something happens and he gets taken out by some kind of a health event very publicly, so that, if he doesn't make it, or if he's in some kind of a condition where he can't tweet, he can't talk, etc., or that he can't himself deny what happened to him anymore, and that they have to use something like an impeachment or the 25th Amendment or whatever and remove him. Now, Democrats would probably get on board for removing Donald Trump if the question came down to it, especially if it was something involving his health. They would remove Donald Trump. And one of the things people are talking about, and this sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it probably is, and I'm not saying this is definitely what's going on, but it is something that would not surprise me, is we have this thing that people are talking about involving Charlie Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica Kirk, and J.D. Vance. Now, it was CPAC or something over the weekend, and J.D. Vance was there, and Erica Kirk introduced J.D. Vance, saying things like, well, he reminds me so much of my late husband. I see a lot of my husband in him. And then they shared, like when he came out on stage, they shared a hug, but the hug seemed very weird. And one of the reasons it seemed so weird is, it seemed more than friendly. He had his hands around her hips. I'm sure you've seen this photo. And she had her hands running her fingers through the back of his head and the hair back there. Now, as a bald guy, yes, I know. I don't know much about hair. But if I had a friend, a female friend, especially someone who was recently widowed in the fashion that Erica Kirk was, and she was hugging me like that, I would find it very odd. I have never really had a female friend do that. And I know with several of my friends, if I do give them a hug, my hands don't immediately go toward their hips. I try to make sure of where I'm placing hands so there's no awkwardness there. Now it seems weird. Then you have the fact that JD Vance has made comments about wishing that um, his wife Usha Vance would convert to Christianity. Well, why would he say that? Well, he's trying to make himself more palatable, potentially for a 2028 run, probably with Marco Rubio as his counterpart. But I think they're trying to set the stage up to make him more palatable to MAGA because they know something is going to happen between now and the end of Donald Trump's term where JD Vance, one way or the other, will have to step up and become president. He may have to end up filling in the gap and being the president of the United States, whether it's 25th Amendment, whether it's an impeachment and a removal, or whether it is just Donald Trump chokes on a Big Mac and there's no denying what happened. Now, if the Democrats win the midterms, would the Republicans back a movement to get rid of Donald Trump? Probably, especially if it was based on something legitimate. Now, again, don't expect the Democrats to just go impeaching Donald Trump for any old reason. They would have something solid. But if the Republicans are serious about trying to move away from Donald Trump and set themselves up for 2028 to have a chance to win the presidency, they need to set somebody up like JD Vance and make him sympathetic. And the way they could do that would be by removing Donald Trump when the Democrats have control of Congress and saying, well, look at poor JD Vance. He didn't get a chance to really do anything at all because the evil Democrats had control of Congress. You must give him another chance and put us back in control of Congress. I don't think that would work, but I could see them trying to do that to make him sympathetic. Now, that being said, there is a lot going on with all of it. That's a lot of moving parts, all stemming from one election night. But what we have is momentum for the side of the Democrats. Now, we are in day 37 of this government shutdown. Now, there has been some reporting by some news outlets claiming that the Democrats are getting ready to talk and actually cave on the government shutdown because they think that they proved their point with the elections and that, they held out and that, they will accept that Republicans now know that they're beaten and et cetera, and that they may take a promise. No, if you do not get concessions in something that you are going to pass to open the government, you do not open the government. And I want the government open, and I want people to be able to eat, and I want access to all of those government programs for everybody who needs them. Don't get me wrong. However, you do not give in to the Republicans at this point. You've held out for too long. I think if the Democrats cave at this point, they squander everything they just earned, all of the momentum they have going into 2028 or 2026, rather, they've squandered if they give in and get nothing out of it other than promises. And why would you accept promises from a party that has done nothing but lie to you? In March, they passed a clean CR, keeping things funded at 2024 levels. Okay. Then they turned around and said, well, we will, if you do that, which Democrats did, we promise we will have discussions about the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Those expire at the end of the year. We'll have that discussion later. All right. As it sits today, there are 56 days to the end of the year. How much later is left to fund anything for the Affordable Care Act for next year? Now, I've talked about it in previous podcasts about how Republicans want the Affordable Care Act to fail. And I still think that's true. And they're still not actually negotiating yet. Now, we're hearing some talk that there could be bipartisan movement on a deal. But unless that deal includes extensions of the Affordable Care Act by multiple years and extensions of or changes to the cuts that happened because of the One Big Beautiful Bill in Medicaid, Democrats should not give in. Because if it's just going to be promises to deal with it later, then you should just caved way back in September and passed that CR. You did nothing, you gained nothing, and you would have squandered any sort of momentum you have going forward. Now, one of the things we've been talking about with regards to bringing the House back into session has been Representative Grijalva, and how Mike Johnson is refusing to swear her in. Well, there could be something coming up that may force him to swear her in beyond, um, you know, just it being well past time in this lawsuit. There is a lawsuit where he is being sued by the Attorney General for Arizona, trying to force him to swear her in. But I don't know how well that is progressing. No, but there could be something else coming up. And what is that? Well, in Texas, there was an election um, for a vacant seat by somebody who had died in office. This was held by a Democrat. Well, they did not hold a primary like a typical challenge where it would just be one Republican versus one Democrat. They didn't do any of that. They had an open election, and the top two, if nobody got a majority of the vote, are going to head to a runoff. Now, the top two are both Democrats. Nobody got enough votes to be a clear majority winner, but this was in a majority Democratic district anyway. So, at some point in the future, which might be as early as the end of December, early January, based on how these events normally go in other states, they have not set a date that I have seen yet. There is going to be an election for another member of the House of Representatives. And the choices in this runoff, it is going to be between a Democrat and a Democrat. Now, I don't know anything about the candidates involved. And I'm not from Texas, so I don't know anything about them. I don't know who they are. I couldn't tell you who to vote for in that case. But the simple fact is, after this election, that would be another Democrat in the House of Representatives that would need to be sworn in. How is he going to keep, from swearing in two members of the House of Representatives if they're not back in session by the time that race gets held or called? So he's desperately trying to keep her out because he's trying to avoid a vote on the Epstein files. Well, there's a problem. He's facing calls from his own party to bring the House back into session. And one of the things I've been talking about is that depending on how the Epstein file vote goes, he may lose his job as Speaker. He may also lose his job as Speaker depending on how this shutdown fight goes. None of it's guaranteed for Mike Johnson. He could end up getting vacated as Speaker of the House. Well, we talked about how he may face a motion to vacate depending on how this goes. And how Republicans may decide to get rid of him because they had to help hold this vote. Donald Trump doesn't like Mike Johnson right now, or he won't like Mike Johnson if he allows the Epstein files to get released, or for there to be a vote on it anyway. And Republicans don't want to have to face either option in this vote to call for releasing the Epstein files. Why? Well, because if they release the Epstein files, Donald Trump is going to be pissed, or if they vote to release them, he's going to be pissed because he wants them buried. He has already said that anybody who votes to release the Epstein files is hostile to this administration and to the president. He may try to do primary challengers and things like that. Okay. But then they have to deal with, if they vote to keep the files hidden, they have to deal with their base. And their base believes that only Democrats are in the files and that they want all the proof about how evil Democrats really are. None of this is good for Republicans. They don't know which way to go here on this. So Mike Johnson's solution to not hold a vote on the Epstein files is to not swear in Representative Grijalva. And like I said, he could be facing having another Democratic member to swear in. How does he keep them out? Well, if he's trying to avoid a motion to vacate the chair, that's not going to necessarily work because apparently Marjorie Taylor Greene has indicated that she is going to try to vacate the Speaker of the House. It doesn't take very many Republicans to call for the vote. Now, it takes more than it did last term for Congress. During the last 2 years of the Joe Biden presidency, it took just one member of the House of Representatives. I think the magic number is 5 or 7 or something like that. But either way, a far cry, it's a little more than one. But with Marjorie Taylor Greene saying she is going to call to vacate the chair, Republicans are worried here. What happens if they do vacate? I know Mike Johnson's worried. What happens if they vacate? Do they have to go find a new Speaker of the House? Well, it depends on Democrats. If all Democrats side with, you know, the Republicans here, they will only need 5 or 6 Republicans, I think. Not even that. I think four Republicans, because there's 214 Democrats right now, counting Representative Grijalva. If they side with the Republicans, Mike Johnson's out as Speaker of the House. They have to find a new Speaker. Now, what happens? How do they find a new Speaker? Well, they keep voting and voting and voting till they get to a Speaker, and no House business gets done. Now, how could Democrats affect this? Well, they could do a couple of things. They could turn around and they could agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene and say, okay, yeah, Mike Johnson's got to go, and oust him. Or they could turn around and they could say, okay, Mike, you want to keep your job as Speaker? Here's our list of demands. And say, okay, we need to, especially if the government's not open, all right, we need to hold a vote. We need to fund the government for this period of time. This is what we need on the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and this is what we need on Medicaid cuts. You get us the votes we need to pass it, the 4 or 5 votes. We pass it, we open the government, but in return, we will save your job as Speaker of the House. Okay, that might happen. Now, Mike Johnson being, a stooge for Donald Trump, he may not go for that because Donald Trump doesn't want to negotiate to keep the government open. It's going to come down to, does Mike Johnson want to keep his job as Speaker of the House more than he wants to, help Donald Trump? But see, that's the other thing. If they've already funded the government, there could be something else Democrats want. They say, okay, we want a vote on X, Y, or Z. You do that. You bring it forward and you get us the votes to pass it, and we will save your job. And if they don't, or Mike Johnson doesn't, they could turn around and say, okay, well, we're not going to save you. 4 Republicans, all Democrats, they vote to oust the Speaker. They have to find a new Speaker. It took them 3 weeks the last time when they voted to get rid of Kevin McCarthy to come up with Mike Johnson, this clown. So because they may not have anybody, what could happen because of it? Well, it wouldn't take very many Republicans, and if there's enough that they're getting sick of the chaos being caused by people like Mike Johnson and MAGA, etc., they could turn around, and it's unusual but not necessarily unheard of, although I couldn't tell you the last time it has happened. They could turn around and say, all right, we're going to vote with all Democrats, and we're going to vote in Speaker Hakeem Jeffries. Now, if we get Speaker Jeffries this term, even though Republicans are in control, does it change the balance of power in the House? No. Why? Because there are still 218 Republicans in the House of Representatives. They are still in control. They are still the minority party. All putting in Hakeem Jeffries would do would be guarantee that there is somebody competent in the room, deciding what's going on. All right. That's it. That's what they're doing. If they decide to go that route, they would have somebody, because Hakeem Jeffries wouldn't keep the House of Representatives out for 6 or 7 weeks now and not be negotiating, trying to open the government like Mike Johnson's doing. He thinks he's winning. He thinks he's putting leverage on Democrats. And in fact, all he's doing is pissing people off, not getting anything accomplished, and apparently costing his party elections if you look at what happened Tuesday night. So they could vote to vacate the chair, and we'll probably end up with a Republican, and they'd get somebody probably who we had never heard of, because we had never heard of Mike Johnson. He wasn't a household name. He wasn't a major player in the Republican Party prior to him being selected as Speaker. And that's typically how these things go. Unless you're a very outspoken member of the House, there's a lot of members of the House we've never really heard from. They're there, they're doing work, but because they're not overly outspoken, if you're not in their state or their district, you may not know who they are. So they'll probably end up with some Republican that we don't know or had never heard of before. And then we'll turn around and just get through this term, going into the midterms, and they hope that they can survive and keep control of the House for the Republicans. But I don't think they do. I think they lose the House by 40 to 50 seats. The momentum is going in the Democrats' favor. But the only way that momentum stays in the Democratic favor is if they do what they need to do and actually get something out of this government shutdown, extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies, maybe getting some movement on cuts to Medicaid, and getting potentially some money restored for food stamps, etc. If they do not get at least something out of it, then they've failed and they may not get a chance to be in power in 2026 after the midterms. There's a long way between here and the midterm elections, but we are now looking forward to the midterms. We got to start looking at primary challengers. We got to start looking at who's running in varying races and starting to gear up toward the 2026 midterm election cycle. You're going to start seeing even more political ads. As we get closer to primary season, you're going to start trying to figure out who's running in varying races. And, you're going to have a lot of state governor races, state house races that are going to have primary challenges. And make sure you're paying attention to those as well. They are just as important as the national races. And if the Democrats can keep a unified message and figure out a way to get a unified message going at the same time while still addressing the types of candidates you would need to have in varying areas, because the same message that worked to get Mamdani elected as mayor of New York is not going to work potentially here in Iowa. Not really. You'd have to tweak the message just enough and say it a different way in order to have it work. But Democrats could potentially do that. If they can get a unified message and they can keep the pressure up and they keep riding this momentum, they could make major gains in 26 and in 28 and get back to having a Democratic president in 28. But when we have a Democratic president, here's the thing. In 29, when that next president takes over, assuming it's a Democrat with a favorable Congress, we have to be patient. Okay? It took Joe Biden to bring the economy back from where it was under Donald Trump post-COVID to where it was when he left office. It took him 4 years to fix it. Was it fixed perfect? No. Were there still plenty of issues? Yes. In part because he couldn't get everything he wanted done. But one of the things they need to address is the fact that people are struggling. It's not just about what numbers are Wall Street producing and things like that. We got to look at kitchen table issues and whether or not people can afford to live. We've got out of control rent prices. We've got out of control grocery prices and just cost of living. And when you can't afford to live on a minimum wage job anywhere, that is a problem. People need to have an affordable cost of living. And they need to figure out how to make that happen. But if Democrats do it right, they could have a favorable majority in both houses of Congress and a presidency in 29. But it's going to take years to fix all of the damage caused by this administration. And potentially, if I'm right about Donald Trump not making it to 29, by the up to 2.5 years, whatever it will be, of a Vance administration, it's going to take time. It's going to take money, and we may have to end up ultimately raising taxes, preferably on the wealthy. And one of the things we can't do is if they start talking about raising taxes on the wealthy is do what people always do when they talk raising taxes, is freak out about our taxes going up. We need to pay attention to what they're saying, specifically when they come to, well, only people making over this dollar amount. It is ridiculous how many times they've talked about raising taxes on people making more than I think the last time it was over $400,000 a year, I think is where they were talking. Maybe it was even higher. And I knew people around me who barely made 20 something a year. And they were saying, well, they're not going to raise my taxes. No shit, they're not going to raise your taxes. But because they talked about raising taxes at all, you had people freaking out that their own taxes were going to go up because they weren't even thinking about the fact that they weren't anywhere close to those caps. So they would have to make that message just right. But the Democrats could be poised to make major gains and then start fixing all of the problems caused by this administration. All right, that's everything I got for you today on the Analytical Iowan podcast. I want to thank you for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow. There's going to be more to talk about because, of course, there always is.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.